this session so that we can capture the presentations, and I'm going to keep track of the time. We have approximately 20 minutes for each speaker with some questions following, and then we'll see where we end up with the conversations this afternoon. And now I think it might be that we only have Janne. Emmanuel is still on the train somewhere trekking across Europe. But Janne and Emmanuel together have been the powerhouses for the Helsinki Initiative. They were there from the start, and they've certainly made it what it is today. So I'm delighted to turn the microphone over to Janne to let us know what has happened and what will come next.
Thank you very much, Henrika. And it is indeed a great pleasure to share with you this moment of 5-year anniversary in the cafeteria at the House of Science and Letters in Helsinki with Henrika and Vidar, Emmanuel, and some other Finnish colleagues. So I start sharing my screen. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, that looks good.
Great. So, in principle, Emmanuel should be presenting with me, but I believe Emmanuel is somewhere in train, maybe somewhere around Poland. So I will be happy to walk you through this presentation of Helsinki Initiative 5 years. Here is the plan of the presentation. So I quickly tell you about the Helsinki Initiative and also briefly introduce the 3 main recommendation topics of the initiative, looking a bit on the topic itself and on how the policy environment especially has developed during the past 5 years. So let's start with the Helsinki Initiative. Helsinki Initiative was launched the 3rd of April 2019. Here you can see logos of the 5 organizations involved as original signatories. There was Cost Action NRES, European Network for Research Evaluation in Social Sciences and Humanities, Federation of Finnish Learned Societies, Committee for Public Information in Finland, that is Henrika's organization, Universities Norway, the Rectors Conference, and also Finnish Association of Scholarly Publishers. And really, this was an initiative to foster an environment that values multilingual scholarly communication, and the long-term goal of the initiative is to ensure that the continued availability of high-quality research in all languages that we need for effective communication and production of research across countries. Today, Helsinki Initiative has over 100 individual and organizational signatories from over 76 countries. And this, of course, shows that multilingualism in scholarly communication is a not only national concern, but also an international concern. The 3 main recommendations of the Helsinki Initiative relate to, first of all, supporting dissemination of research results for the full benefit of society, meaning multilingual communication within and beyond academia. And that is only possible if we have a healthy infrastructure for publishing and communicating research results in different languages, meaning we need to have a healthy and hopefully open access environment for journals and book publishers to do their work. And thirdly, the third recommendation relates to promoting language diversity in research assessment, evaluation, and funding systems. We need to take care of the incentives. So researchers have to be rewarded and recognized for their effort as authors, their contributions to science and society, but also as editors, as peer reviewers, even as translators, everyone who contributes to creation and communication of knowledge in different languages, and therefore to the epistemic diversity. And what we mean by multilingualism, this many of us can actually understand it a bit from different angle. So we can look at it from the point of view of publication, in how many languages is one and the same document available. Or we can look at it from the researcher perspective, in how many languages a researcher communicates the results within or beyond academia. We can also look at publishers and journals, what is their repertoire of languages offered for publication. We can also look at different disciplines and fields and their patterns of language use in communication and outreach. We can also analyze the language diversity of the entire publication output of an organization or a country. And finally, we can also look at society or societies. What are their needs for availability of research-based knowledge in different languages? So a broad range of different kind of perspectives, what we can understand by multilingualism in scholarly communication. So let's then move on to the topic of the first recommendation. So multilingual communication for the full benefit of society. And here we often think that scholarly communication in different languages is only SSH thing. But we know that actually scholarly communication takes place in different languages across fields, also in STEM fields. Here we have evidence from Finland and Poland. And that evidence shows, based on comprehensive national publication data, that Finland is a typical example of a country that where STEM researchers publish almost all their peer-reviewed output in English. And then social sciences and humanities researchers also use other languages, especially Finnish and Swedish. The Polish environment is, however, quite different. Their STEM researchers also publish almost half of their peer-reviewed output in Polish or other languages. So that means that STEM researchers or STEM research in Poland is actually more multilingual than differences also between countries in peer-reviewed scholarly communication. But when we move on to look at science communication, the type of communication that is targeted to professional and general audiences, and it is not peer-reviewed typically. There, the differences between fields start to disappear entirely. And there we can also see, and this is evidence from Finland, looking at the entire output of Finnish universities of non-peer-reviewed publications. And here, both STEM and SSH fields produce most of their outputs in international languages. Well, this is, of course, reality and shows that to communicate effectively, to reach broad audiences, we need different languages. And this is comes nicely out of the UNESCO recommendation on open science published in 2021. Very important document, making multilingualism integral part of the definition of open science. So we need to make multilingual scientific knowledge openly available, accessible, and reusable for everyone. And also, UNESCO recommends to member states to encourage multilingualism in practice of science in scientific publications and in academic communications. Maybe Ismail will talk about this more more in his part of the webinar. Then we have Council conclusions from Europe on research, assessment, and implementation of open science, where the Council of the European Union encourages the use of multilingualism for the purpose of wider communication of European research results. This is also very high-level political recognition of the value of multilingualism in communication. And also the Council welcomes initiatives to promote multilingualism, such as Helsinki Initiative. So very nice milestone, I could say, for the initiative. And I would also like to mention a very recent declaration by European Civil Society Platform for Multilingualism that also supports the principles of the Helsinki Initiative, but they also want to promote, even in a broader perspective, multilingualism in higher education when it comes to governments, research and publications, teaching, learning, and also communication. And they also highlight the importance of paying attention to language technology tools in this process. So that's what has happened with regard to the first topic. Then let's look at the infrastructure for multilingual scholarly communication, the second recommendation. And here again, it's possible to say that if we make effort to really map the global landscape of journals, we have started such an effort with Mikael Laakso and have come up with a list of almost 150,000 serials, unique serials across the globe. And here we can see that more than half of the journals are either multilingual in the sense that they can also include English, but also publish in other languages, or they are entirely published in other languages than English. So this means that there is the global journal landscape is much more multilingual. It's also much larger than we perhaps may think if we typically look at Web of Science or Scopus indexed data. And we also know that, and looking at a DOHA database, and of course, Joanna knows this much better and maybe provides additional information. We know that APC funding, open access funding model really seems to be feasible for English language journals. This could be because they are targeted to international audiences. And almost all journals that are either multilingual or published entirely in other languages than English use the diamond model. That is also important to remember. And indeed, there are also important policy initiatives. For instance, Action Plan for Diamond Open Access, promoted by Science Europe, Operas, the French National Funding Agency. And here it is also recognized how cultural, multilingual, and disciplinary diversity is really one of the strengths of the Diamond Open Access sector. And there is a strong joint effort to improve this ecosystem of publishing. Also, we have Council conclusions from 2023 highlighting the importance of non-profit scholarly open access publishing models, and here also emphasizing, while promoting open access publishing and allowing for diverse range of formats to coexist, we also need to allow for publishing in range of languages. And here we have, again, a nice recognition of the importance of multilingualism in the open access, Diamond Open Access publishing context. I briefly just mention another important element here are two EU-funded projects to develop the Diamond Open Access ecosystem. The DIAMAS project is aimed at improving the standards of Diamond Open Access publishing, and there are specific efforts to improve publishing in different European languages, but also to develop toolkits, guidelines, and training to publishers to manage and increase availability of multilingual content. For instance, publishing the same texts or abstracts in different languages. And there is also another, let's say, sister or brother project, Craft OA, that is more focused on the technical aspects of Diamond open access ecosystem. And here also specific effort is made to address and solve, for instance, open journal system ways of processing multilingual content. So some help is on the way for the journals in the Diamond open access ecosystem to be able to better serve communities with multilingual information. Then finally, I would like to turn to the multilingualism in assessment and funding systems. And here we have clearly different kind of problems. The most well-known is the metric problem, or the traditional Web of Science and Scopus-based metrics, because these databases cover journals that are typically international and published in English, mostly. But unfortunately, many evaluators still think that only research of any value to science and society is published in journals that are indexed in Web of Science or Scopus, or they have impact factor. But this leaves out a large, makes invisible, very large and important contribution of researchers. In this case, in example I show here on the slide, large share of SSH researchers across 7 European countries published peer-reviewed journal articles in local languages of their country. That was actually 88% of researchers in Poland and 29% of SSH researchers in Flanders. However, the Web of Science and Scopus databases covered only between 3 and 8% of 94,000 peer-reviewed journal articles published in 3-year period in the local languages of these 7 European countries. So clearly we can see that there can be very important disadvantages to individual researchers or even research field if assessment is relying on the Web of Science and Scopus data. Then, of course, the assessment reform is looking to use more let's say, prioritize qualitative information to support assessment. And this involves also narrative CV. A narrative CV is a very, very good tool that may enable researchers to showcase and evaluators to evaluate a broader range of relevant skills and experience and contributions to science and society. But then maybe another problem comes in, especially how narrative formats may disadvantage non-native language procedures or any other context. So somehow we have to find ways to support non-fully fluent researchers in such evaluation contexts. Also here, important policy advances have been made. I want to first mention what I'm sure Laura will be elaborating more, is new principles for research assessment in Latin America, published in 2022. And their principle 8 says, writing in English does not confer a merit per se superior to publications in other languages. And also, FOLEC is nicely endorsing the Helsinki Initiative. We also have very, very important document in Europe, recently approved in December 2023, the European Charter for Researchers. And here under open science, it is pointed out that employers and funders should reward true open science culture across the union. Of course, considering differences among disciplines and cultures, including also multilingualism. But maybe the most important part is the non-discrimination part, highlighting that employers and funders of researchers should not discriminate against researchers and so forth, including language. And this is also a very important principle. And finally, this is my, I think this is my final slide. Very important document, Agreement on Reforming Research Assessment, was published in 2022. Already signed by maybe even over 700 organizations across Europe and also globally, which has 4 core commitments. The first one of which highlights that we need to recognize valuable contributions that researchers make to science and for the benefit of society, including diverse outputs beyond journal publications and irrespective of the language in which they are communicated. This agreement also has a toolkit where Helsinki Initiative is highlighted as a possible resource to use on how to address issues related to language. But one important thing that is also to look toward the future, COARA has accepted a working group on multilingualism and language biases in research assessment, the goal of which is to raise awareness about the importance of multilingualism in research, in communication, but also to develop toolkits, guidelines, and help measures for research organizations to respect their commitment to recognizing the diversity of outputs and also irrespective of languages. So here you can find information. It's still possible to sign individually or on behalf of organization. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Janne. I think what we see is the valuable research that Janne and Emmanuel and their colleagues have done on giving us a snapshot of what the multilingualism publishing scene looks like globally from the countries that we can get access to the sort of information that we require, and also that multilingualism does appear quite consistently through different type of declarations and aims and plans and documentation as a key issue. How do we get from the reality that Janne's research shows us and the aspirations in all the multiple declarations to find a bit more common ground, I guess, is one of the big topics for us this afternoon. Now, have you got any questions or comments regarding Janne's presentation? Janne, in his typical thoroughness, I guess, has left us all very fully informed of the issues. In this case, I think we thank Janne for the presentation and the hotel Wi-Fi for carrying him through, even though you were a bit concerned about it. And we can move on in our program. Next, we're going to hear from Ismail, who works at Leiden at CWTS and is also very committed to the evaluation reform through the Leiden Manifesto. Ismail also works for the UNESCO Chair on Diversity and Inclusion in Global Science, which sounds incredibly interesting. And the way we've structured this is that Ismail's talk gives us a way to look at the first commitment of the Helsinki Initiative about supporting dissemination of research results for the full benefit of society. So Ismail, I'm delighted to give you the floor.
Thanks so much for the invitation and congratulations to the Helsinki Initiative. I followed it from the very beginning with great joy, and I'm very happy that it's moving forward with initiatives such as this webinar and leading important working groups like the working group of Coara for multilingualism. So what I'm going to do in these 20 minutes, let me get the time started, is looking at the science policy rationale for multilingualism. But before, let me introduce briefly our UNESCO chair and why this is related to multilingualism. The chair on diversity and inclusion in global sciences looks into diversity and inclusion, but since our center is focused in research assessment and particularly in bibliometrics, we focus on the epistemic topic inclusion. For example, issues about inequalities in health, in how research is not addressing these inequalities, how there is little research in the diseases of the Global South. We're also looking into the lack of coverage of the journals from the Global South in the self-proclaimed global bibliometric databases. And in general, we support the UNESCO in thinking about their commitments, such as the recommendation on open science. Okay, so having said this, let me introduce what will be the argument for my talk, which is that the most common argument to support multilingualism is that it's because it helps in sharing scientific knowledge with the population or scholarly knowledge. I'm going to use science to mean all scholarly knowledge, not necessarily the natural sciences. But I'm going to say that this is a very important reason indeed, and we could call it instrumental imperative because it's pragmatic, but there are other imperatives which I will delve a little bit longer, which what we might call the normative imperative, the democratic, which is because science is a human right. And this is something that in science policy we often do not discuss, but it stems from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then there is a third imperative, which is because actually having science constructed with various knowledge leads to more robust knowledge. And we will see that the way we understand the construction of knowledge is moving from a closed or from a more closed view of science in the lab to a view of science being co-created with citizens and stakeholders. And as we move to this more open science from the point of view of engagement, language becomes a key asset in order to enrich knowledge. So let's go along these three rationales. The first rationale was already introduced by Janne. So the fact of using mainly the national, some form of official language usually, to reach out the relevant knowledge to practitioners, for example, in medicine, or briefs for policymakers, or books to reach to citizens, or educational resources, or documents for agricultural extension, fostering scientific literacy against fake news. For all these, scientists have to reach out to the language that are most understood by communities. So this is a very strong reason why research should be published in various languages. And these, one of the articles expressing this was Gunnar Siversen in 2018, a bit before, Gunnar being also one of the group of promoters of the initiative, the Helsinki Initiative, in an article that he published in English and Catalan in 2018. And this view of having language fit for purpose, with recognizing a variety of purposes and recognizing the importance of the social impact of research, is a view that is in a way captured by the vision of COARE. So if the Coalition for Research Assessment wants institutions to recognize the activities of researchers across a variety of contributions, it needs to recognize as well the contributions in a variety of languages. The second imperative, in a way, might be quite simple, but I have to confess that it came to me as a surprise. Having worked for 20 years in science policy research, I was not aware that science is actually a human right, as written in the Declaration of Human Rights, which last December we celebrated the 75th anniversary. So Article 2 is the one which says that the rights in the Declaration should be enjoyed without the distinction of any kind. Neither race, color, sex, nor language should be a reason not to benefit from the human rights. And Article 27A states that everyone has the right to freely participate in cultural life, but also to share in, this is to participate, in science, in scientific advancement and its benefits. So bringing the two together, this means that ideally we should have scientific institutions that would allow the participation of citizens in science and would allow all citizens to benefit from scientific advancement without distinction of language. Now, the implications are actually that we are not in a good place in relation to this commitment, because there's plenty of evidence that both the knowledge and the benefit of science are very unequally distributed across multiple dimensions: gender, class, neighborhood, across countries, other regional, big global divides between ethnic groups. And language is one factor in this intersectionality that compounds with inequality. So to bring in the dimension of language is important in order to democratize science as a means for citizens to participate and as a means for citizens to benefit from science. But also as a means to have science as an institution that is participated, where researchers come from more diverse origins. This ideal that comes from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has been restated and updated in the UNESCO recommendation of 2021 on open science, which restates this vision of science as an inclusive construct with multilingual scientific knowledge made openly available for the benefits of all society, also beyond the traditional scientific community. And this recommendation in open science is it's very clear also about the values that should be associated with the notion of open science, which include equity in these dimensions of the Article 2 of the Declaration of Human Rights, such as gender, ethnic class, or language. And it also includes the importance of diversity, in which bibliodiversity, the many ways in which science can be communicated, linguistic diversity, and topic diversity are part of the mix. And perhaps it's worth rethinking when we talk about open science that we are not necessarily talking only about the open scientific knowledge, which is important. So open access, publications, open educational resources are very important. But in this UNESCO framing, there is also open infrastructures and crucially, open engagement with society act as an open dialogue with other knowledge systems, which should also be conducted in ways that respect this diversity of languages we have in the world. And I will move now to the third imperative, which is thinking of the plurality of languages as a way of constructing a better science, in the sense that it allows learning from stakeholders and citizens. And this is, of course, very important in the case of indigenous communities, but it's also important in very modern cities, which have populations from many origins. This change towards revaluing the language, I think we could associate with the rethinking of what does local versus global means and what does old versus modern means. So in science technology studies, people like Sandra Harding have highlighted that the scientific endeavor, and I would say not only scientific in terms of the natural sciences, also the social sciences, have been part of empire historically. And Sandra Harding explains where science is associated with the new, the modern, the white, the male, the cosmopolitan, versus the local that was associated with the old, with the conservative, with female, non-white, ethnic, and in a way, ignorant. And sadly, this type of dichotomy of tradition versus modernity is not something that happened only in the pre-World War II empires, but are still present in the clashes that we can see today as globalization of various kinds is marching across the world. This has led to a variety of movements in the last 10 years across the world. Maybe the most famous is the decolonizing knowledge, decolonizing universities that sprang out in South Africa. And people like Latour have proposed that what we should be doing is not to think anymore in a dichotomy between tradition and modernity, between the conservative, where the local is the past and the global is the future, but in other forms of thinking the world, he calls it a terrestrial attractor, in which knowledge can be constructed in a variety of context, and their language is part of the equation. Now, in more specific terms, in terms of science policy, this might be related to the shift in what we understand from science or in innovation policy from the linear model, in which it was assumed, you know, that you create science, this leads to technology, this leads to innovation, and this leads to well-being, and would only need the language at the very end to translate the innovation to the beneficiaries. To innovation systems, we were still very focused on the economic system, but recognizing that these models that existed, or that actually still dominant, have led to science to contribute to forms of economic growth or that did not necessarily lead to well-being. There's been problems with climate change, financial crash, and the diagnosis has been that scientific enterprise was not listening sufficiently to the citizens across a variety of settings in the world. So we need to situate and contextualize research and innovation where, who, for whom. And this means a knowledge that is co-created with the people in specific sites. And as such, language becomes a crucial asset as a spaces, as a tool, but also as a tool, but also as a cognitive tool to articulate research with societal needs and aspirations. And this is the type of use of language that we can see in public engagement and citizen science. An example here of a colleague of ours in the University of San Martin in Buenos Aires, who is running a project engaging local citizens in a very poor area of the periphery of Buenos Aires, where there is a lot of pollution. And there, of course, the research has to be conducted in Spanish, and also it has to be brought back in Spanish to the citizens of the neighborhood. And it has to be brought up to the citizens in a language that can be understood by them, given that they have constructed part of the knowledge. But this is also the case, I should go here, in initiatives such as the smart specialization strategies of the European Union. Here we have the example of the Catalan government, in which they've developed shared agendas in which, in specific counties of Catalonia, territorial stakeholders, the local hospital with the local university and some local companies have set up agendas to go towards prioritizing what type of knowledge would be relevant. In this context, again, using a variety of local languages, the pertinent local languages is very important. So in conclusion, science needs multilingualism, not only as a way of getting science to the citizens from a top-down view, but also in order to hold to the democratic values of inclusion, of equality, this notion of the UNESCO that science is the participation of science is a human right, and also because of the value that citizens and stakeholders can bring to science and to scholarship. And I will finish as well with a question, which I am narrated that I'm not asked, but whether multilingualism also needs science, in the sense that I have the hunch or the impression that it's very difficult, that it'll be difficult for languages to survive the 21st century if they cannot engage with science, given the big technological transformations that we are undergoing. And thanks for the attention. And congratulations again, Janne and all colleagues.
Thank you so much, Ismail. The thoughts about multilingualism that sometimes you hear about it being kind of stuck on top of something else. You have now given us a lot of thought about the fact that multilingualism is in the core of what science and research is about and an engagement with society. I could see some hands coming up, but then gone down. Was it Lynn who had her hand up? Did you want to comment or ask something from Ismail?
It was applause, actually,
It was
clapping.
applause. Do you want to verbalize that applause? Any Lynn?
Yeah, sure. It's not a question so much as a comment, but I really, really like the last point that you made, that multilingualism needs science. This is like a light bulb thing going off for me. So I really appreciate that perspective, because I had never considered it in that way, but I work with terminology, and one of the things that I've noticed is that there are languages out there that have not developed scientific terminology for a lot of very recent modern concepts because they are so used to working in English. And this is, I think, a terrific example of how multilingualism needs science, that they're really a symbiotic kind of relationship. So thank you for articulating that so clearly, because I think that's a point that a lot of people, or a perspective that a lot of people don't view it through. And now that's given me a lot to think about. Thank you.
Thanks.
Have we got any other questions or comments?
I would especially welcome these agreements, as it's the first time I've gathered these thoughts.
Well, I don't have a disagreement. Sorry to disappoint you on that one. What really struck me, I often go back to the Human Rights Declaration on multilingualism and on open science and all the endeavors that we're doing. But what struck me was my last slide, as Lynn pointed out, but also about that idea of inclusive innovation, that you track down the sort of innovation models that we've used, and we've seen that they don't necessarily produce the best outcomes from well-being's perspective, and that language and inclusion are the things that can change the way we are in society and the way we innovate, and even kind of the question said, for whom? Why are we doing this? And bring us back down to ask the really fundamental question. That language is built into that potentially gigantic change with the way we view the innovation cycle that science and research is part of. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that one?
So I think that before we go to this, instead of language is part of a way of the researchers dialoguing with the citizens, the stakeholders, people who have different types of expertise, in order to think what type of knowledge we would like to create. So this idea comes after realizing that the model in which the scientists supposedly discover things that become then technology and then become innovation was a very naive idea. Because when we look at science, and of course it does not operate in a political or economic void, but it is very strongly shaped by the inequalities in power and economic resources of various types. So In India, you have 5 times more research on cancer than you would expect according to the disease burden. And this is explained because Indian researchers want to participate in the global research market and because there are demands. And the same, so you can think then that actually the use of English as the only language can be thought as part of a certain political economic order in which science is a key component. In delivering the technologies and the expertise that you need in a certain political economic order. Now, if we want to and make a transition towards more just health systems, we also need to change the way health research is conducted. And to do this, you need to listen. An example that I learned doing research on obesity in Barcelona, like biomedical researchers were interested in many things, but one of them, the genetics of the microbiome, which is now so problematic. Now, speaking with nurses, they were very aware that there were many problems of obesity among the migrants from Peru and Ecuador and from North Africa, with 2 different population sets. And therefore, well, that would be an example where the use of language, like being able to speak with the women who have just arrived from North Africa, who don't speak Arabic, right? They speak the Berber language. In order to understand and to be able to discuss how to improve, how to keep their cuisine, but improving the uptake. That would be a form of, doing health research that would be very relevant for the obese population of the poor communities. But this is not the type of research that gets funded, because the people who knew this were the nurses, not the doctors, or not the biomedical doctors.
So that the language threat goes from the very top, the big level global political funding, down to the bedside in your example, that the thread of language shapes what we do and how we do it and for whom we do it. It's not separated at all into a separate category that we need to put a multilingualism sticker at the end of it, as is often kind of referred to. That's the last thing we need. Oh, yeah, we need to translate this. That is a beautiful example. Are there any other questions or comments at this point? If not, I really thank you, Ismail, for broadening our horizons and bringing that sort of deeply philosophical and cultural perspective into the conversation of language. And now we've all been sitting for an hour. So I suggest that we take a 3-minute break, and I suggest everybody stands up and does a little bit of stretching to get our blood flowing and our bodies feeling a little better. And then we all primed to listen to Joanna. So 3 minutes, we'll be back right on the hour. So do a little good to your bodies in that short break. Okay, hopefully you all feel a little bit refreshed. And now we're going to move on to talk about the second element of the Helsinki Initiative, which is about protecting infrastructures for publishing locally relevant research. And we're going to hear from Joanna Ball, who is the Managing Director for Directory of Open Access Journals, DOAJ. Joanna's got a background in the libraries. She's a proud librarian and has got a lot of experience in management and leadership, and is a great advocate for open access. So Joanna, welcome and thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Henrika. I'm just going to see if I can share my screen. Okay, can I just check that you can see that now?
Yes, we can.
Excellent, fantastic. Well, I just want to say, as everybody else has, congratulations to the Helsinki Initiative. It's been so important in raising awareness of and advocating for the value of multilingualism in research, and it's a real honor for me and for DOAJ to be here today. So I'm going to be speaking from the perspective of the Directory of Open Access Journals. We're a global index of peer-reviewed open access journals, and we were founded 20 years ago by the library community. And we're still very proud to be community-led and community-supported. As an index, all the journals that we index within DOAJ need to apply, and they are assessed against our quite rigorous evaluation criteria. And over the years, these criteria that we have come to be seen as a standard for open access publishing, trusted by publishers, librarians, researchers and funders across the scholarly community. We have, as an organisation, a wider mission to support the reputation, the impact, the visibility of all quality peer-reviewed open access journals from all countries, disciplines, and in all languages. And we, as part of that, and as part of our commitment to bibliodiversity, we are a signatory of the Helsinki Initiative. These figures here illustrate the diversity of the index. We have journals from 134 countries altogether, and with 80 languages. And we're now up to about 20,000 journals in total in the index. This is a figure that we share very often because it defeats one of the myths that's growing up around open access journals, which is that to publish open access, you need to pay an article processing charge. So 2/3 of the journals within DOAJ do not charge article processing charges. And actually, that is a figure which hasn't changed very much over the last few years. And given the increase in the number of gold APC journals from the big publishers during this time, I think it shows really well that diamond or non-APC journals are holding their own and are continuing to develop. And this slide illustrates the global nature of DOAJ very well too, and we have strengths across all, well, nearly all continents. And I think the other thing to mention is that we index all types of journals. Those can be we might be indexing hundreds of journals from some of the big publishers, but over 50% of the publishers in DOAJ only index one journal. So we have a very high number of very small publishers within the index. Why is multilingualism important for DOAJ? Well, I wrote the explanation we've just had from Ishmael has been much more articulate than anything I will be able to present today. But we believe that it is an essential element of bibliodiversity, and which is, of course, important for healthy research communication ecosystems. It enables knowledge equity.
Can I check if I'm the one who's frozen or has Joanna's connection frozen?
I can't hear either.
Yes, I think
Okay.
it's Joanna's connection.
We'll just give her a moment to see if her connection returns. And if not, we might jump to Laura and then return to Joanna after that. So Laura, if you can get yourself ready, and we'll see what we can do if we can't see Joanna's connection returning. Okay, I think she might have lost us all together. Laura, we might be a quick and agile here and change the order a little, because Laura is here to talk about the assessment part of the Helsinki Initiative, the third aspect. And Laura coordinates the Latin American Forum for Scientific Evaluation. Janne referred to FOLEC in his presentation. And that's for the Latin American Council for Social Sciences. And she is a member of the executive board for DORA and part of the COARA working group on multilingualism. So Laura, how about we get to enjoy your presentation? Hopefully Joanna will join us shortly. Oh, there you go, Joanna. We're going to give you a little moment to get yourself settled for the hiccups. We'll do Laura and then we'll return to you. Would that be okay with you? And we'll make sure your connection is stabilized. Okay, Laura.
So thank you very much, Enrica. I will share my screen. And also it is an honor to be invited in representation of FOLEC Claxo to this meeting celebrating the 5th anniversary of the Helsinki Initiative, with which Claxo adopted from the beginning, and that was very inspiring also for the Latin American Forum Initiative in Claxo. And I appreciate very much also to share this session with admired colleagues. So thank you very much. Well, first of all, as you mentioned, I will make a focus on the Latin American Initiative on research assessment for FOLEC, and how it is related with the promotion of multilingualism in the context of Latin America and the Caribbean. So first, it should be said that there is a wide linguistic diversity in Latin America and the Caribbean, as in other parts of the world. 300 million people in America speak Spanish as their first language. 247 million people speak English as their mother tongue. 200 million people speak Brazilian Portuguese, and about 8 million people speak French or French Creole. And we have also plenty of native languages. Only 4 of the dominant language families are the Quechua, which is spoken by 9 million people, the Aymara by 2.2 million speakers, the Guarani by 5 million speakers, and the Nahuatl or Aztec by 1.5 million people, which are now considered, or in the last decades, in danger in our region. So in different diagnoses made by specialists from Claxo's networks, we have made like a diagnosis of the limitations of multilingualism in science communication. First, some of the documents of Polek emphasize that dominant forms of evaluation stimulate clearly, as it was mentioned before, the publication of articles in English in detriment of other formats and language communications, and there they exclude part of the knowledge production as in many countries and regions in the world. So monolingualism also disincentivates fluid dialogue among academics who share same languages, not only in our regions, you know, as in other world regions. In a recent report from, well, it's not so recent, in 2020, a report from the organization, Ibero-American Organization States, showed that 90% of the total articles in scientific journals were in English, and only 1% were in Spanish or Portuguese. So we also emphasize the limitation of the representation of different languages in traditional or the so-called mainstream circuits of publication. And besides, a report made on multilingualism by Polek and Claxo shows that there is a growing trend in Portugal and Brazil to publish in English. And even in the social sciences and humanities, which in some cases show a more frequent dissemination of results in local languages, it is also observed, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean, that due to the incentives or research assessment incentives in some countries, there is an increasing trend to publish also in English. I will. Also, I would like to mention that language barriers have widespread impact in research culture. As you know, there was an incredible or a very useful report by Ramírez Castañeda, published in PLOS, that revealed that English hypercentralism not only impoverished the record of science, but also substantially affects the publishing possibilities of researchers from non-English speaking countries, who are constantly subject to reviews requested by journals claiming that they need to have their texts proofread by native speakers. So I think that this is also when we assess or when we analyze how research assessment careers are being assessed, this is another difficulty that appears particularly in our systems. From Claxo Declaration of Principles, as Janne was mentioning before, Claxo states that writing in English does not confer a merit per se superior to publications in other languages, and that multilingualism favors the development of socially relevant research, as Ismael proved before, and contribute to sustaining cultural diversity. So this declaration of principles, that it was signed by more than 300 institutions and individuals, claims that there is no reason to apply a general language of format hierarchy in the review of social sciences and humanities, and all forms of publication and local languages are necessary. Also, we know that the recommendation on open science from UNESCO states that open access to scientific knowledge and interaction between science and society is possible only if scientific knowledge is produced, communicated, and used in multiple languages and formats. And I would like to point, this is a very traditional topic in research assessment, but it's not yet sorted out, that also the recommendation on open science established that inequalities among scientific communities and particularly in many countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, the inequalities caused by article processing charges or book processing charges also affect the possibility to communicate, to disseminate the research that is produced in our region and in different languages. As we were mentioning, there is a wide language diversity, not only spoken by the people in our region, but also in the regional databases or the regional journals in Diamond open access of our region. Spanish and Portuguese subsist as languages of publication in the circuit, in the Latin American circuit of open Diamond, open access Diamond journals like Latin, Del Cielo, and Redalic, and they include thousands of predominantly university-based journals managed by the community itself and by academics. In a recent research that Fernanda Beigel conducted together with Cielo and Redalic, showing the scientific output in journals edited in Latin America and the Caribbean, it is shown there clearly the language diversity that this circuit of publication can offer. Particularly, we see there that Spanish and Portuguese have a central role, but also the significant presence of English that accounts with 23.9% of the articles. French has a very limited presence, as do other languages, some of which appear only once. Portuguese, logically, is found mainly in journals published in Brazil, and it is also interesting to note that 62.4% of the articles in Brazil journals were published in Portuguese, when 1/3 was published in English. So we see that outside Brazil, Mexico, Puerto Rico, and Chile journals, an average of 5.4% of the articles are only in English, according to this investigation of the Oliva database project conducted by Fernanda. And on the other hand, Portuguese as a language of publication outside Brazil's journals is very low, representing only 5.4% of the articles in other journals of the region. So there are many motives for change in research assessment in Latin American systems. particularly a change that introduces and values multilingualism. We know that the heteronymous assessment indicators used in ranking systems and accreditation of institutions based on international commercial services only reflect, as we have shown, a small % of the quality publication in our region, of the journals of quality or the quality journals publicated in our region. So one of the main things in which many initiatives in our region, like Oliva, Redalic, Cielo, Latindex, La Referencia, and also outside our region, particularly the initiative of Open Alex, the initiative of the UNESCO Inclusive Science and the Leiden University, is trying to improve the coverage of open scientific information from Latin America and the Caribbean in global open infrastructures. And that could be a key to make visible and expand the circulation of scientific knowledge and local knowledge produced in different languages, formats, and to nourish with this open information, different indicators, different situated indicators that could be generated in the institutions of Latin America and also by the national science and technology agencies. So, regarding how to include multilingualism in research assessment, well, FOLEC followed very much the discussions and proposals of the Helsinki Initiative, and we agree with this statement that explicit or implicit languages prioritize that are being prioritized in assessment compromise equal opportunities for individual researchers and institutions, and can also implicitly or explicitly endanger local relevant research and knowledge that is co-constructed or co-built outside academia. So we, in this point, we would like to emphasize what the initiative recommends, that is to take into account publications outside the so-called mainstream databases, and also engaging sufficiently diverse pools of experts and linguistic skills in assessment panels. From the FOLEC initiative, we produce with different experts of the region, particularly this document, which is the promotion of biodiversity and multilingualism. We had the collaboration also of Fernanda Baker. And there are some examples or proposals for introducing research assessment, for introducing or for validating multilingualism in research assessment were made, particularly regarding academic career assessment. Examples for encouraging multilingualism are including a % of publications in Spanish, Portuguese, French, German, or other languages in relation with the total amount of publication that is being assessed in the access and promotion of scientific careers in each of the evaluation systems of the region. And that at least one publication in indigenous language should be also produced. Of course, this should be contextualized in each of the evaluation systems, and also we are making focus here just only on publications, but the idea of this document and of FOLEC is to make emphasis in biodiversity. So it could also cover publishing in indigenous languages in different types of formats like books, like articles, impress, different ways of disseminating the results of research in our region. So, sorry, there. Other supportive initiatives promoting multilingualism, and particularly some of the languages that are spoken in our region. One is Ciencia, which is an interdisciplinary thematic platform developed by the CISC in Spain, which constitutes an important resource to value and understand scientific communication in Spanish. Also, we think that repositories, institutional repositories, the wide network of institutional repositories in Latin America have made a systematic progress in harvesting and curating institutional output in the region. There's still much to do about that. And they are making really great efforts, but that is also another big open database of the different formats and languages in which Latin American researchers produce and circulate their contributions. Also, taking into account the cultural tradition of social sciences and humanities to publish results in the format of academic books. Also, the Directory of Open Access Book, the DOAB, it's a very interesting tool to incorporate the books and that are published in our region, and that should have also a peer review ones that are included in that database. And also from FOLEC, we have been following the Norwegian model, Christine. We think it's a very interesting initiative, as it includes books also for faculty performance evaluation, using qualitative classifications in different disciplines, and their publications in local languages. And also we are following the changes or the reforms in that initiative, because we think it could be useful also for the Latin American scenario. So last, as it was mentioned before, FOLEC Claxo is also very glad, and it's very stimulating to support the COARA working group on multilingualism and language biases in research assessment. We think, as all of you do, that all languages have value in scientific communication, and we are trying to do all our efforts at political, economic, and more cultural instances to make it worthy also in research assessment. And finally, just I wanted to comment that we think that strategic alliances across language interests, including international and subnational languages, could also bring better opportunities and more comprehensive and global national and local strategies to introduce or to value and recognize multilingualism in science production, circulation, and communication. And also the fact that in some Latin American contexts also multilingualism is currently a very important key to mitigate scientific denials, yes, for example, to engage people, to engage citizens in science, yes, and to strengthen democratic culture. So thank you very much. I'm sorry for my English.
No need to be sorry for that, Laura. Any questions? I can see Janne applauding. any questions for Laura and the South American experience? Because my thought has been that all roads lead to assessment in the end. That if we don't fix assessment, we don't fix anything else either. And that, I think, goes for what Ismail shared earlier. If we want to change the way we innovate and engage and what we research, we need to have an evaluation system that rewards in the new world rather than the one that rewards in the previously dominant research culture. And Laura, what from the perspective of multilingualism you think is the biggest challenge in the South American cultural context? You've got a lot of Spanish and Portuguese publications at the moment. So what do you see as the greatest next challenge for you in this space?
I come back to a previous idea. We think from FOLEC and Claxon with many allies in the region that the big challenge is to make all that production visible, representative in global regional databases. Because if the production exists, but we need to nourish the evaluation systems that are currently taking place in our region. So we think, and many of us think, that is one of the key points to then make different incentives, tools, instruments in national systems to recognize that production. But first, we need to make it visible for all, and we are working with many allies in the region and outside the region in that task.
I hear you. I think that is the challenge. You and Janne have provided the data, how poorly those are visible. Janne, do you want to add to that?
Thank you, Laura, for a fantastic presentation. I would like to ask what is your experience or understanding from the Latin American context, looking at the researchers there. To what extent does the level of fluency in English language give an advantage in research careers? How important determinant is that characteristic of researcher, that they can really use English language in communications and publishing?
Yes, absolutely. There is a big distinction or segmentation among research careers, and particularly is a required that is exclusionary in some disciplines, yes, particularly in the more STEM disciplines or in natural sciences, where publication in mainstream circuits is the only way in which academics can make progress in their careers. So I think that is also a big segmentation in career path. And that's why we have different initiatives to support better language, better writing and communicating in English in some of the countries in the region, yes, as a main objective of scientific or universities. But as we know, that is not the only way to do it. Yes, another way is also to recognize what we are doing here, different formats of language communication. But of course, it is the competence in English, writing and speaking is also a factor that segmentates career path in our region.
And Ismail,
I think.
thank you, Laura.
Thanks, Laura. Always a pleasure listening to you. One of the things you emphasized was that bibliodiversity could be important in communicating science to the variety of publics. Well, given that even within the same language, the capacity to read, let's say, a history book in very unequal societies might differ quite a bit. So issues, I wonder to which extent it makes sense. And this might be also the case in very unequal European cities, let's say London or Paris, right? Should we think as part of multilingualism as well, communication in languages that are understandable by a variety of peoples, including the social classes that have not had the privilege of going to university? And Jan, it's also for you. Is this part of the conversation?
Laura, would you like to respond first, or should I?
Yes, I think that it's very important, this point that Ismail makes. And actually there is a trend in many evaluation systems of the region to better value or recognize dissemination, yes, of the results in different formats, and not only in journal articles. I think that the prestige or the journal articles are mainly like a defense of disciplinary communities, yes, and of their search or their search of internationalization, and there we have another point of discussion. But institutionally, the national agendas, local agendas are trying to make more diverse the format, the languages in which research is communicated and disseminated, mainly because they also want, and for them it's necessary to show the results, the incidence that research has on society, particularly when it's funded by publicly funded, but also it has to do also with the issue of the democratic culture that I was mentioning before, no? The fact that citizens can trust the process of producing knowledge, and that they are involved is very important for our societies, for our political systems nowadays.
If I may continue, I fully agree, and I think that this is very much should be a central aspect and topic of multilingualism. And I learned a new word from Lynn. We also talk about intralingual translation, don't we, Lynn? Maybe you can say later if I pass the exam. Of course, if we translate a medical paper or physics paper just from English to Finnish, I don't understand any more of it. So certainly we need to also package and tailor and format research information in accessible form and style to different target audiences. And I guess clear example is popular audience, general public, or policymakers, for example, that really don't have the patience to read academic papers, and really they are not targeted to them. Of course, there is also the option of making a plain language abstracts, which that can be helpful here. So I agree that this is an important topic. I wanted to mention also something that Ismail and maybe you also, Laura, emphasized, the importance of communicating in local languages when you want to engage citizens and do participatory citizen science. Because recently in a conference, there was a session on citizen science where researchers from different countries were explaining their absolutely fantastic citizen science projects. They were explaining it in English, and the only thing they forgot to mention is that every one of them seemed to have involved local researchers as kind of translators to be able to communicate fully with the citizens and participants, because they were not fully fluent in the local language, or and this is also part of the, let's say, multilingual communication or interaction. And at somewhere in the bottom there is the very important task to develop languages as language, the scientific terminology and capacity to have meaningful dialogue and discussion about topics, scientific topics. But that Ismail raised in the very end, I think it relates to that as well. Sorry, a bit long.
Now we are hoping that the powers of the internet connections are on our side, and Joanna is able to join us with her presentation. Thank you. That was a wonderful conversation that goes definitely to show that multilingualism is a very deep and fruitful topic that we can explore and look at from multiple different perspectives. And I'll let Joanna to continue on one of the key aspects, which is that we need platforms to be able to share in different languages. So Joanna, go ahead.
Thank you, Henrika. And I'm not sure how far I got last time before I was cut off. I was happily chatting away, and I don't know when I got cut off. So I don't know
if you start your slides, I think we can point out where we got cut off.
Let's do that. Okay.
We did not see this one.
We didn't see that one.
No, we didn't.
Okay. Did you see this one?
That's where you were. I think we got to the second column about knowledge equity.
Okay. Well, I thank you. And I think for the sake of moving things forward, and I think we've heard lots of justifications for why multilingualism is so important. I think for DOAJ, we feel that we can play an important role for multilingual journals because we know that they're not indexed very often by commercial databases. So we know that we can give them quality assurance and visibility that they will find difficult to get elsewhere. So here, and this is just what I was saying, Scopus and Web of Science and DOAJ, there you can see all three databases. And this is some work we did last year to look at coverage between the three databases. And you can see that there are a high number of journals in DOAJ. So at that point, there were nearly 10,000, so half the journals that weren't indexed in either Scopus or Web of Science. So I want to make a disclaimer because the data I'm focusing on today is DOAJ data, and we know that the open access ecosystem is larger than that. PKP have measured over 34,000 titles using their OJS software. There are lots of titles in the open access Diamond Journal study. We know that many journals from outside the global north are not yet listed. But on the other hand, the community does use DOAJ as a primary index for open access journals, and they use it to make assumptions and make statements about the open access ecosystem. So bearing that in mind, what do the journals in DOAJ tell us about multilingualism in the open access ecosystem? So the data I'm looking at today is a very recent analysis of our journal list, so over 20,000 titles, that was carried out by Yvonne Lujano, who is our community manager, and was built on some previous work that she did with one of our ambassadors. So when journals apply to be indexed within DOAJ, we ask them to indicate what languages they accept articles in. And this data here shows that over a third of the journals within DOAJ accept articles in more than one language. And if we break that figure down further, we can see that the majority of those multilingual journals accept articles in 2 languages, but there's still a significant proportion that accept journals in 3 or more languages. So it's clear that the journals are providing support for a number of languages. Of course, English remains the most dominant language within DOAJ, but this is a list of the most frequent other languages that you might see in the index, and that shows a real diversity of the open access landscape. As you might expect, there's a very high number of journals where the main language is Spanish or Portuguese, reflecting the strength of the open landscape in Latin America, which we've just been hearing about. And Indonesia and Indonesian and Persian also feature due to the very strong open access movement in both Iran and Indonesia. So, and if we move to another way of looking at this geographically, you can see that there are a number of countries that have a high number of multilingual journals, and this is where you see the strong representation from Latin America, but also some of the European countries coming in where they have a very strong, perhaps a strong national journal platform. For example, Herceg in Croatia. So if we look at business models, I think this is where it becomes very clear. Multilingual journals are predominantly diamond journals, and that's to say they do not rely on APCs, and that has a significant impact on how they are run and the resources that they have. And you can see here by looking at, if you compare monolingual and multilingual journals in our index by the business model, you can see that the split between APC, non-APC for monolingual journals is quite balanced, whereas for multilingual, you really do see that emphasis on diamond. And as we might expect, when we look at the multilingual journals in DOAJ by discipline, we can see strengths in humanities and social sciences, but there is also a significant number of journals in the index that are multilingual and are in STEM subjects. Some of the other trends that we see at DOAJ from our experience with speaking to and working with open access, multilingual open access journal editors, they know that DOAJ indexing and other forms of indexing, of course, as Scopus and Web of Science, helps journals to achieve a greater international visibility. And there is still the notion that English increases a journal's profile and prestige, and those things are quite hard to break. We've talked about how research assessment might be able to combat that, but therefore they like to translate article abstracts into English so that to enable their indexing. I alluded to this a little bit before. There are challenges that we see for multilingual journals when we look at our metadata. Support for multilingualism requires resource, and we know from various studies that diamond journals, multilingual journals, are generally under-resourced. So based on our information, we can see that only 28% of multilingual journals in DOAJ report having adequate preservation in place, which means that they could be at risk of disappearing. We know that 26% of our multilingual journals do not use DOIs or other persistent identifiers, which aid their discovery. Another point is that 19% of the journals have submitted no article metadata to DOAJ in the last year, which again will impact their visibility and means that those articles are not visible in library catalogues across the world. So we've heard from Latin America, multilingual diamond journals are thriving, particularly in some areas of the world. And I've also added the Open Edition platform here from France. But what I do want to highlight is some of these national platforms that there's more and more of them springing up that are based on PKP's OJS software. And I've selected here 4 from Northern Europe, Netherlands, Finland, Denmark, and Sweden. But I could equally have chosen platforms from Indonesia or from Africa, because there are a number of national institutional platforms using this software. And why is this software important? Well, because it supports multilingualism. A significant proportion, so 42% of the journals within DOAJ use PKP's Open Journal System software, and half of those are multilingual. PKP has really good support for multilingual content. It has an awful lot of pages to help multilingual journals develop a strategy and work out how they're going to deal with their content. They have a multilingual community of practice. And Jana also mentioned earlier, there's an increased focus on technical support for institutional publishing using the OJS system through the Craft OA project. And that includes, for example, enhanced support for multilingual journals. So making sure that that metadata or multilingual metadata is being picked up by crawlers, just as an example. So there are challenges for multilingual journals, but it is widespread across the open access ecosystem. It's thriving in national platforms. Multilingualism is closely related to the Diamond model, and so faces the same challenges that Diamond faces due to the lack of resources. But the current focus and investment that's going into Diamond at the moment, going into infrastructures, going into publishing, I think is going to really strengthen support for multilingualism over the coming years. And I just wanted to finish with this quote, because I really liked it. It comes from a report from the second Diamond Open Access Conference last year in Toluca. And it really sets multilingualism at the heart of diversity and bibliodiversity. And it really, multilingualism is the center of the Diamond movement. And I think that's a very positive and upbeat note to finish on. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you were able to follow that and we didn't have any more horrible internet problems.
No, thank you so much, Joanna, and the powers of the internet were on our side. The idea of multilingual journals and national platforms using OJS, to me, are a beautiful and a significant and a sign of seeing this diversity happening in reality, that we don't need to segregate, that we can find ways to bring that diversity to work along it and alongside each other, that the separation and the boundaries are getting softer. And the number of multilingual journals that DOAJ has got in its index, I think, is a really positive sign for that cultural change that Ismail was talking about, that change in the way we look at things, that we see less need to categorize and put things in separate boxes. Now, has anyone else got comments or questions for Joanna around elements of diversity and multilingual publishing and the index system still prioritizing very biased set of journals that not capturing our full spectrum of multilingualism? Our presenters are so thorough. Jan.
Thank you, Joanna, for excellent presentation. I would like to ask if you can see, well, I suppose you can see maybe from the OHA data and some of the surveys you have contributed to that many of the publishers of, and maybe you mentioned in the early part that many of the publishers of multilingual or non-English language journals are publishers of just one journal. So they are maybe societies or university department or whatever type of typically non-profit publisher. So maybe if you have in DOHA also the seal that kind of shows the technical high standard of open access that is produced. Can you see a difference clearly there that maybe the multilingual and the small scale publishers have much more difficulty in reaching the highest technical standards compared to maybe the commercial players?
Absolutely. I did look at this as when we were looking at the figures, and I think the average for I think about 10% of the journals within DOAJ have achieved the DOAJ seal. And for those of you who perhaps aren't familiar with the seal, that is around are they sharing their article metadata? Do they have preservation in place? Are they using DOIs? There's a whole load of kind of seven technical standards that that journals need to meet. And so the average for journals within DOAJ, 10% of journals within DOAJ have the seal, but only about 3% of the multilingual journals have the seal at the moment. And that's because as I mentioned, there are issues there with preservation. There are issues there with not having the funds to be able to get a DOI. And so I think that's where initiatives like like Diamas and Craft that you were talking about, these wider initiatives to really support those smaller journals come in. And I would say as well, it is hard for them to compete with the larger commercial publishers on those criteria, because the commercial publishers use kind of cookie cutter websites, so it's very easy for them to for all their journals to achieve the DOAJ seal. And we know how challenging it is for publishers that only have one journal.
And I guess the national platforms that you had on one of your slides, the Northern European examples, is one way to help smaller multilingual journals to get to the technical standards, that we find solutions in this sort of collective powers of providing, for example, national services that make these things possible.
Yes.
Did you want?
Yeah.
Sorry, Joanna, go.
I'm sure Jan has a lot to say about that, but absolutely. And I just wanted to give the example of the Swedish platform Publicera, where we have worked as they've built the platform and developed the service. DOAJ has worked with them to make sure that DOAJ compliance and therefore visibility is kind of built in to all the journals that they include on the platform.
Jana, did you want to add one last thing before we invite Lynn on the floor?
Yes, I just wanted to comment that this links also to what Ismail said about open research infrastructure. So open infrastructures for research information, for example, as in OpenAlex. So that it's extremely important that we have identifiers for used by different language journals so that they can become part of the bigger infrastructure and be visible there. And there is also what Craft OA is also working to improve.
Ismail,
I have a quick
comment.
follow-up on what Yanni just said. When we step out of Europe, I think there is often a debate about centralized versus decentralized platforms. And I think countries in the global south are, for good reasons, reticent about centralized platforms in the north. For example, I understand that countries like Cuba, Iran, and Venezuela have problems in paying the DOI because of the North American sanctions. So, and you see, so this seems to be a terrible interference, right? So I wonder whether you have put some thought about the decentralization and the role then national or regional platforms can play in making the world a less uneven playing field.
Joanna, did you have a thought on that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's not something I was aware of, but I know that DOIs, for example, are extremely challenging. But for example, within DOAJ, we will also allow other handles or persistent identifiers because we know what the challenges are. But I agree that there needs to be a balance between centralizing where it makes sense, where there's economies of scale and where there's efficiencies, but also retaining kind of local control where it makes sense too.
Well, it's a really valuable contribution to thinking of the complexities that different contexts bring into the participation in different elements of our global research community, and the local diversity versus standards tension is something we should not ignore from a very narrow Northern European or Northern perspective. So thank you for alerting us yet again to the complexity of this issue. But now I would love to invite Lynn Barker to share with us what technology could do or could not do, depending on where she's going to go with her talk, because Lynn is a linguist and a professor of translation and information studies at University of Ottawa. And she's going to talk about how, I believe, machine translations and technologies are going to support us. So Lynn, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be at the end of this panel today because I think that so many of the things that have been touched on are going to come up again in this presentation, and I am really kind of struggling to see how we're going to make this work, because there's so many pieces. We've seen that policy is important. We've seen that infrastructure is important. And now I'm going to talk about technology, language technology, and how that is another piece of this puzzle. And it's a very complex issue, but also a very exciting one. And I will just say happy anniversary to the Helsinki Initiative. And thank you for the invitation to be here today and to think about how we can keep this conversation going and moving forward. So yes, I'm going to talk about language technologies and particularly translation technologies and their potential for supporting multilingual scholarly communication. I'm going to talk a little bit about how they work because I think that's important. It's our understanding of how these tools work that will allow us to better assess their strengths and their limitations within the context of scholarly communication. And so I'll start by saying just that there was a major shift in the landscape, the technological landscape. Machine translation is a much older technology than people might realize. It's a technology that has been around for almost 75 years. In fact, 2024 is the 75th anniversary of the launch of machine translation. So it's a much older technology than people might realize, but it has had a very significant sort of split or division in the way that we approach it. So for the first 50 or so years of machine translation, this was a period when computers themselves were relatively new. We know that they were slow, they had very limited processing power and limited storage capacity, and that not everybody had one. You know, there was a time when people didn't have computers in their pockets, and not even on their desktops. And if they did have a computer, the computer was most likely operating in a standalone mode. And it was during this period that developers of machine translation tools were trying to kind of use the way that people process language as a model for how the computers could process language. So they were really relying on linguistics, and the approach that they used was one that we now refer to as a rule-based approach to machine translation because it relied very heavily on grammatical rules. So the computer programmers were literally programming grammar into a computer and trying to get the computer to follow the grammar. But since around the 1990s, we've noticed a really significant shift in the technology landscape. Now, as I said, computers are everywhere, not only on our desks, but also on our wrists, in our pockets, all around us. And they are much smaller, much faster, much more powerful, and they have a lot more storage capacity. So this has opened up a new way of approaching machine translation. Coupled with that, we see that because everyone has a computer, we are producing texts in digital form, right? We don't handwrite things anymore. We don't typewrite things anymore. We really are producing machine-readable texts from the get-go in our word processors. And at the same time, our computers are not standalone anymore. They're talking to one another. We have the internet, the web. It has made it really easy to access data and to share data. So this environment that we're in now has led to a rethinking of the way that we can approach language processing. The linguistic approaches had kind of a limited success because computers are not good at processing grammar, and they're especially not good at other types of information that people use when they communicate. So when we communicate with each other, we rely on more than just grammar. We rely on our understanding of how the world works. We rely on our understanding of a communicative context, and computers don't have that. So they weren't able to go very far with just linguistic knowledge. And now in our data-driven world, we have kind of almost set linguistics aside, and we are looking at a data-driven approach to language processing. So that's what I'm going to explain because that's the reality that we're in right now. These new tools like large language models and neural machine translation use a data-driven approach. And you might have heard other language that goes along with data-driven technologies. You might have heard terms being thrown around like transformers and vectors and word embeddings. These are how neural networks operate. Happily for you today, I'm not going to go into that side of things because I don't actually think we need to know all of those nitty-gritty details as users of technology. If you're interested in it, you can find lots of information about how neural networks operate. But for today, I would really like to focus on the data side of things because a data-driven technology, data is the central piece. It's really important. Without the data, the tool would be completely useless, right? If we take data away from a large language model, the algorithm on its own can't do anything. Data is essential. So it's kind of like the fuel for these tools. If we think about a car, we know that, the car will just sit there on the street if it doesn't have any fuel in it, right? It can't go. Even if the car is well designed and it's a wonderful car, without fuel, it can't do anything. So data is the fuel for our language processing tools today. But we also know that in addition to needing enough fuel, we need enough fuel to get where we're going, we also need to think about the right kind of fuel, right? We don't want to put gasoline in an electric car. We don't want to put diesel fuel in a car that needs regular gasoline. So we have to think not only about the volume of fuel or data, but also about getting the right kind of fuel. So that's the thing that I'd really like for you to be, as your takeaway today, is to understand this data piece. And so when we talk about these large language models or neural machine translation tools, anything that operates with a neural network, we're talking about something that's referred to as machine learning. And how does machine learning work? Well, in principle, machine learning is actually quite simple. The first thing we have to do is identify a task. So our task could be something like classifying photographs, or it could be something like translation, right? We have to think of a task that we want the tool to learn. And then we show examples to the algorithm, to the computer tool. We show them examples of what we want them to learn. So if we're focusing on image classification, we might show them different kinds of photographs. If we're talking about translation, we're going to show them texts that have been translated in the past, so previous translations. After we show them some examples, we're going to give them some feedback. We're going to say, like, maybe try this task, try classifying some photographs, and I'll tell you if you're right or if you're wrong. I'll give you some feedback. So just like a student, like we might teach students, by giving them feedback, we'll reinforce good examples and we'll, draw their attention to bad examples and say, don't do that. And then after this training period, what we do is we test the tool with new data that it hasn't seen before to make sure that it's learned the right thing. Otherwise, we might go back and repeat our training and extend it. So in principle, that's pretty much all that's involved in machine learning. But in practice, there are some things that we should keep in mind. When we say that we should identify a task for AI, we know that in the world, there are many different types of tasks, and we could maybe roughly group them into two categories: narrow tasks, which are very, very specific and very easy to document the steps, and general tasks, which are a little more vague and perhaps a little harder to describe. Machine learning works much better on narrow tasks. So the more specifically we can define the task for a tool, the better it will be able to execute that task. We also said we have to show examples. Now, many of you have experience teaching or training, or maybe you're a parent and you have kids, or you've got a younger sibling. So you know what it means to show examples about how to do something, how to tie your shoe or how to read or whatever. People, even little kids, can often pick things up with just a handful of examples, right? How many times do you need to show someone how to tie their shoe? Maybe 3-4 times, and then they pick it up. Machines are really not smart at all. They are genuinely not smart. And when we say that we need to give examples for machine learning, we're not talking about 10 examples. We're not talking about 100 examples or 1,000. We're talking about millions and millions and millions of examples. So this is really important, right? So we need to give enough examples to the machine for it to learn something, for it to be able to identify patterns and repeat those patterns. And so this is where we talk about having enough fuel for our system or for our car. The volume of fuel is immense. It's literally millions and millions of examples. So that's already a big job, right? To kind of find that many examples, but it's not enough to only think about the volume of examples. We do need to think about finding the right kind of examples, because if we give poor examples to the machine, it will learn the wrong things. It will learn how to do something badly, And that's not what we want typically. We don't want it to do a job badly. We want it to do a job well. So we have to be very selective about the type of examples that we give. And we always, always, always need to keep in mind that AI of any type is not smart. These tools process data, but they do not understand it. They don't have any concept of semantic understanding the way that people do, right? They literally can process it without understanding, and that is important to keep that in mind. Okay, so now we have a little bit of an idea of what it means to be data-driven. And these data-driven tools have some tremendous strengths. Their potential for translation and for translation in scholarly communication is fantastic. I'm very excited about the future and the potential of these tools for scholarly communication, multilingualism, for helping us to diversify the languages used in scholarly communication. Some of the strengths of the tools are, well, for one thing, they're largely free. So this is, that's an accessibility issue, right? We know that professional translation can be very expensive, and that can be something that excludes people from getting their work, presented in different languages, the cost of translation. Also, the time investment. Professional translation can be a time-consuming process, and we may not all have easy access to the types of translators that we need. If our research, as it usually is on a very specialized topic, we can't just ask anyone with a knowledge of another language to translate it, but they also need to understand the subject field, right? So it can be tricky to find a professional translator who works in your language pair in your subject field, and who's available and affordable. So we see tremendous potential for these tools in that sense of giving better access to translation. I also have to say that this newer approach, and this is a little bit upsetting to me as a linguist, the approaches that don't use linguistics are actually very fluent. They sound good. This is a big difference between the data-driven machine translation and the old rule-based machine translation. The older approaches often sounded very awkward and clunky. You could really tell that you were reading a sort of mediocre translation in terms of the language quality. Now with data-driven tools, they sound great. They're much more fluent, and this is a good thing, but it also can be a little bit of a tricky thing because it can sound good even when it's not right. So that's a sort of a downside of it. Sounds so good, it's so convincing that we might not question the accuracy. But another strength of these tools is that they can learn, right? This is great. The tool might not be perfect today. In fact, it's not. These tools are not perfect today, but they have the capacity to learn, so we can hope that they will get better. But the big caveat for all of this is that these things are true, and the tools work quite well when we're dealing with what we describe as high resource situations. High resource means that there's a lot of good examples available. And when we talk about what makes a good example, we immediately think of language. And of course, language is very relevant. So we need lots of examples in English, in French, in Spanish. Okay, that seems pretty reasonable. But they also have to be on the right topic, right? So the more specialized our research is, probably the fewer people have written about that. So we may not be able to get a large number of examples on a very specialized topic. And text type is also important. There's a difference if we take the field of legal writing, for example. There's a difference between a contract and an academic article. They might both talk about the same aspect of law, but they're a very different text type. So we have to consider more than just language when we're putting together these good examples. They have to be of the right text type, they have to be on the right subject, and in the right language. So if we can get all of those things to come together in a large number, then we will get pretty good output from our machine translation system. So very good. The challenges come up when we have less examples, or fewer examples, right? And this is where some of the limitations of machine translation are there today, and we need to be aware of these. So let's talk about some of the different problems. You've probably heard of hallucinations, which happens when these types of tools make things up. And this is a real genuine problem with generative AI and also with neural machine translation. They can make things up that were not in the original text. And throwing more data at this problem doesn't solve it. Unfortunately, this is not something that's fixed by just finding more data. So we need to understand a little bit more about the decision-making process of these tools, explainable AI. That's not something that we in the scholarly communication field are likely to solve, but just to draw your attention to the problem, this is something developers need to work on. What is really behind these hallucinations? They're not super common, I would say. Like, it's not every text that's going to have a hallucination, but when it's there, it is a problem. It can be a big problem, and we need to be aware of that. Just to repeat again, a limitation of these tools is that they basically do pattern matching and counting. That's the technique. And there's no understanding of the content of the text. So they're processing it without understanding it. Another important thing to keep in mind is that any tool that is data-driven is very sensitive to the data that has been used to train it. So I mentioned that if we use bad examples, the machine will learn bad things. And we know that bias can be a problem with these types of tools. Bias can be many different types of bias. One that often gets discussed is gender bias. For languages that are marked for grammatical gender, this can be a real issue, not knowing how to translate a pronoun, for example. But I also want you to think about language variety as a potential type of bias. We're here talking about translation between French and English and Spanish, as if there was only one variety of those languages in the world. And what we're seeing is that these tools, if we fill it with English, well, that's great. But what type of English is going in there? As a Canadian myself, I have to say, I rarely see Canadian English as the output of these tools. It's much more often American English or British English. And the same with French. We don't often see Canadian French as being the type of French that's produced by these tools. So there's a risk that these tools will push language varieties that are perhaps not central even further towards the margins as we focus more and more on getting, more and more examples, but the more and more are often the already dominant variety of the language. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. Even if we take varieties off the table and just talk about languages, the coverage of these languages in the scope of world languages is very small at the moment. Google Translate is the tool that has the widest variety of languages that it can process, but we're talking around 134 languages out of the more than 7,000 languages in the world. So again, we're seeing the languages that are already central are the languages that are the best served by these tools, and the languages that are already at the periphery are not being well served by data-driven approaches. There are some great initiatives out there, like No Language Left Behind, but this is already an ambitious initiative to create machine translation for 200 languages. But again, 200 out of 7,000 is a small number. And what I mentioned briefly after Raphael's talk, that what we're seeing is that many of these languages no longer have an up-to-date scientific terminology because they have spent so many years publishing in English. Their own language has become neglected in terms, not maybe in terms of the everyday language, but the scientific terminology needed to discuss, recent discoveries may not be there. So that is, again, how do we get these tools to work when we don't have the examples to show them? So the more specialized content, the smaller our example pool is going to be. Another problem particularly for scholarly communication is that much of the content has been paywalled in the past. So we don't have access to that content to put in these models. And so open access is a really important piece of getting machine translation to work well for a wider variety of languages. So this is sort of something that I wanted to draw attention to, the importance of open access. Okay. Very quickly, because I don't want to end on a negative note, but very quickly, just to say there are some other costs that I think we as a community need to keep in mind. These tools are very computationally intensive. It is not everybody who can run or train a large language model. This is not something you can do easily on your desktop. And it's getting to the point where only large corporations can afford to develop and train and fine-tune these very large-scale language models. And this determines who can and who cannot participate in the tool development. And I think that as a scholarly community, we are very well aware of what has happened with publishing and how a few large players can really dominate the market. What I'm afraid of here is that it's the companies like Google, like Meta, like Microsoft, like Amazon, who are cornering the market on being able to develop these technologies. And that brings with it, again, an emphasis perhaps on English, an emphasis on Western viewpoints. And so I think this is something that we need to keep in mind. Also, the tools are...
We've got 5 minutes left, Lynn,
okay.
just to...
Yep. I will try to quickly finish. Yeah, just to say the tools are freely available now. This may not always be the case. There may be a movement to try and, get money for the tools. And in fact, we've seen that with ChatGPT, right? There's the one version that's free, but the newer version is paid. So we have to be careful that these tools remain accessible. They're really not environmentally friendly. Just to give you one kind of image, because we were talking about cars and fuel, training one large language model has a carbon footprint that is equivalent to the lifetime of 6 cars. And that is one training session. These models are trained repeatedly and fine-tuned over and over again. So this is not currently sustainable from an ecological point of view. It's not good for the environment. So we have a lot of work to do to develop more efficient algorithms and to train small language models. Okay, just in case you have a question about should I be using Google Translate or ChatGPT, these are two related sort of underlying technologies. They both work with neural networks and machine learning. I would say that a tool that is developed specifically for a given purpose, like translation, will probably give you better output than a general purpose tool or a multi-purpose tool. So for the moment, neural machine translation is likely to be a better bet, especially if you are working with a less widely used language. A tool like ChatGPT, 90% of its training data is in English, and only 10% is covering all the other languages that it can process. So it's definitely unbalanced, and it often pivots through English. So even if you ask it a question in French or in Spanish, it's probably translating that question into English in the background, answering the question, and then translating its answer back for you. So there's, again, this worldview, it's constantly being pushed through English and through the English-centric worldview. A very quick mention that there's a lot of resources available on my website, which is called Machine Translation Literacy. And one of the things I would draw attention to is the idea that the best way to influence the output of machine translation is to write the input well, right? Good input leads to good output. And that's something we can all work on. We can all take care to craft our text in a well-written way, and that will make the text more friendly for readers and for machine translation systems. But post-editing will still likely be needed. And my final thought is that machine translation can help. These tools have an enormous potential, but the technology alone is not going to save the day, right? We need, around the technology, we need policies, as Enrique said, all roads lead to assessment. At the end of the day, we need policies to support and value multilingual publishing. We need things like multilingual metadata to support discovery, because if we start publishing all of us in our own language, we need a way to find each other's work. And we need to think about human-computer interaction, that it's not technology alone that will solve these problems. And also, you know, as a future stage, we focused a lot so far on written publications, but scholarly communication has other facets to it. And so we need to give some attention to those facets as well. Okay, and now I will stop sharing and give the floor back to Enrique.
Thank you, Lynn. We've learned so much about machine translations, and the way I look at what we've done this afternoon is we've started with Jan and Emmanuel's sort of how did we get here and what we've achieved. And then we've looked at, someone said this is like a big jigsaw puzzle, how to get all the puzzles to fit. We had Ismail's sort of picture saying we really need to dig deep and look where this belongs and all the things that this is influenced and where multilingualism is meaningful. And then Joanna shared on the other technical elements, and Lynn added a different sort of technical layer to it. And then Laura gave us a snapshot on the key to get this academic community to change, which is through our existing assessment aims and procedures, both for individual researchers and for organizations and for funding and whatever we might be assessing, and how multilingualism is intertwined into all of this. And when you look back at the Helsinki Initiative, the themes that we see important are there in the initiative text, that we need to have assessment, we need to have technology, and we need to remember why we're doing this. So I think this is a beautiful puzzle, and it's a puzzle worth tinkering with and working with. And it definitely is a puzzle that we need to find a solution together as a global community on research. None of us can do this alone, and we need all of these perspectives to see what we really want to see. And I return back to Ismail's thoughts of having research that is truly meaningful and inclusive in our diverse and fastly changing world. Now, thank you so much for all our speakers, for your time and your intelligence and your generous sharing. Thank you, Janne and Emmanuel, putting the webinar together today. And a warm thank you for all our audience members for sharing our journey on multilingualism. I hope this is a start for all kinds of interaction. People connect the speakers if something inspired you, and let's keep this community alive and happy. Now, Janne or Emmanuel, do you want to say the last words before we conclude for the day?
I think it's for Emmanuel.
Thank you. I'm super happy that it's 5 years and it's just the beginning. We see that the topic of multilingualism is now on the global agenda, and hopefully the Helsinki Initiative is one of the driving forces which allow us to talk, to understand, and to improve multilingualism in scholarly communication. Because as we see, for example, as Lynn showed, that multilingualism might be perceived through the English only. However, I do believe that in this community and beyond this community, we can make that multilingualism will grow, the scholarly communication in all languages will grow. And I would like to just say a short maybe anecdote about the very beginning of the Helsinki Initiative. We were discussing whether we should refer about our main theme as in all languages, or rather in your language, in any language. And we, since the very beginning, we wanted to highlight that all languages are important and science can be communicated in all languages. It is very important that any language might be the medium of excellent science. And I think it's one of the key ideas of the Helsinki Initiative. And I'm super happy that I'm part of it. And I would like to thank you all you join Helsinki Initiative and support this very important idea. Thank you.
Thank you, and I hope you all have a beautiful afternoon. And I look forward to meeting you all again in some shape or form around promoting multilingualism. So thank you, everyone.
Nyt sun täytyy, Henrikka, odotella varmaan tunti, että se tallenne latautuu koneelle.